All right, welcome to the lesson on living organisms in the environment. Now, before we jump into it, let's dissect the word biology and figure out what it really means. So, biology comes from two Latin words, bios, meaning life or of life, and logos, meaning knowledge or the study of. So, biology is basically the study of living organisms. Now, how do we differentiate between something being living or non living? Now, for starters, living organisms have a certain set of characteristics that separate them from their non living counterparts. Now, there are 7 of these, and this is extremely important. They tend to ask us a lot in exams and tests and so on, so make sure you really register this. Now, the first thing is that they need to feed. So, nutrition is one of the key things, and nutrition is a process by which living organisms obtain or make food. So, animals take in ready made food and are called heterotrophs, whereas plants make their own food and are called autotrophs. Another key characteristic is that living organisms go through a process called respiration, which is a process by which energy is released from food by all living cells. Now, there are 2 types of respiration. You have aerobic respiration, which requires oxygen and takes place in most cells, and then there's also anaerobic respiration, which takes place without oxygen in certain cells. Another characteristic of living organisms is that they excrete. So, excretion, which is a process by which waste and harmful substances produced by the body's metabolism are removed from the body. Another important characteristic of living organisms is that they move. So, movement, which is a change in the position of a whole organism's or parts of an organism. And for most animals, they can move their whole body from place to place. Plants and some animals can move only parts of their body. Now, another important characteristic of living organisms is that they are irritable or they're sensitive, which means that they possess the ability to detect and respond to changes in their environment or within themselves. Another characteristic is growth. So they grow, which is a permanent increase in the size and complexity of the organisms. And lastly, they reproduce. So reproduction is a process by which living organisms generate new individuals of the same kind as themselves. And there are 2 main types of reproduction. So you have asexual reproduction, which requires only one parent, and then you have sexual reproduction, which requires 2 parents. And here you can see a nice image of a very useful mnemonic to help you to remember these 7 characteristics. And so you can put it together and make the word Mrs. Gren. And each letter spells out one of the characteristics of living organisms. So we have M for movement, R for respiration, S for sensitivity or irritability, G for growth, R for reproduction, E for excretion, and N for nutrition. Mrs. Gren. Now, there are so many living organisms in our environment, in the world. It's important to have a system to properly categorize and classify them for us to study them. And so we have here 3 ways in which you can classify living organisms. So now the first one is using similarities and differences between the living organisms. Simple classifications can be done based on their visible characteristics, such as number of legs, number of body parts, number of wings, presence or absence of antenna, they're hairy or not, the shape of them, even the arrangement of veins in a leaf or an insect's wings. All these are ways that we can classify living organisms. Now, another way living organisms can be classified is by their internal structure and developmental patterns or life cycles. So scientists use internal structures and developmental patterns and so on to classify these organisms. And that is done by comparing their internal structure, internal organs, how they develop and how they grow. Organisms that have a similar life cycle or a similar way of developing can be grouped together. Now, in the more modern way of classification, scientists tend to use the molecular structure of DNA to assist them in grouping these organisms together. So the greater the similarity in their DNA structure, the more closely they are related. And so this will give us the most basic category of classification, which is a species. And now, what is a species? A species is a group of organisms of common ancestry that closely resemble each other and are capable of interbreeding to produce fertile offspring. Then closely related species are then grouped into genera or genus. Related genera are then grouped into families, and then related families into orders, and then orders into classes, and then classes into phyla, and phyla are grouped into kingdoms. And so, as we can see here, there are about 7 tiers of classification. And this is called the taxonomic classification system. And it goes from the largest umbrella being kingdoms down to the smallest one being species. And here you can see we have a photo with a nice mnemonic to help you to remember it. It says King Philip came over from Great Spain. So K for kingdom, P for phylum, C for class, O for order, F for family, G for genus, and S for species. So that should help you to remember the classification system of that. King Philip came over from Great Spain. Now let's take a look at the 5 major kingdoms. We can see here in our photo that we have the fungi kingdom, which includes yeast, molds, and mushrooms. Most are multicellular with a body composed of microscopic threads called hyphae, and a few of them are unicellular. The cells have cell walls that contain a substance called chitin. Their cells lack chlorophyll, and most of them reproduce by the use of spores, and they tend to feed by absorbing their food. So you can picture mold growing on a piece of bread and see the way that it kind of absorbs and consumes it. Next, we have the plant kingdom. So these are multicellular organisms. Their cells also have cell walls, but is made of cellulose. Their cells contain a substance called chlorophyll, which help them to make their own food through a process called photosynthesis. They are typically stationary organisms. Next, we have here the animal kingdom. This is the kingdom that we belong to. So these are multicellular organisms. Their cells lack cell walls and they have no chlorophyll in their cells. And they feed by ingesting food. Most of them move their whole body from place to place, and there's some that only move body parts or limbs. Next, let's look at the Protista kingdom. So this includes the protozoa and algae. So most are unicellular. Some are a simple multicellular organism that lack any complex development of tissues or organs, but their cells have a true nucleus surrounded by a membrane and other membrane-bound organelles. Protozoans are animal-like and ingest food or absorb food. Algae, on the other hand, are plant-like and they contain chlorophyll and make their own food by photosynthesis. So examples of protistas are the amoeba, different types of seaweed like giant kelp, sea lettuce, Irish moss, etc. And then lastly, we have the prokaryote or Monera kingdom. And this is typically the bacteria kingdom, but it also includes blue-green algae. So these are unicellular organisms. Their cells have a cell wall, but they lack a true nucleus, which means that their DNA or their genetic information is free in the cell. Their cells also lack other membrane-bound organelles, example, a mitochondria or chloroplast, and most feed by absorbing their food. And so examples of prokaryote are tuberculosis bacterium, E. coli, Helicobacter pylori, anthrax bacterium. So these are all bacteria that fall into this kingdom. Now let's look a bit more closely at the animal kingdom. So within the animal kingdom, there are 9 phyla. So we have the Porifera, which are stationary organisms which lack tissues and organs, and their body contains a single cavity with many pores in its walls, making a system of water canals. And so examples of this are sea sponges, so the barrel sponge, vase sponge. Next, we have the Cnidaria phylum, which are organisms that have a bag or umbrella-shaped body. Their gut has only one opening, which is the mouth, and they have a ring of tentacles around their mouth. So examples of these are the sea anemone, coral, and jellyfish. Next, we have platyhelminths, which are flatworms. And these have a long, flat, unsegmented body. So, for example, a tapeworm or liver fluke. Then we have nematodes or roundworms, which have an elongated, round, unsegmented body with pointed ends. So, for example, we have a hookworm or threadworm. Then we have annelids, which are segmented worms. So they have an elongated body with segments. So an example of this is an earthworm. Next, we have mollusks, and these have a soft, moist, unsegmented body. They have a muscular foot, and many of them have shells. So for example, we can think of a snail, an octopus, or slug. Now let's look at an arthropod. So an arthropod, they have a waterproof exoskeleton. So exoskeleton meaning an external skeleton, exo outside skeleton, meaning skeleton, and is made up of a substance called chitin. And they tend to have a segmented body and have several pairs of jointed legs. So you can think of, in this situation, any sort of insect or spiders. Next, let's look at echinoderms. So these have a body based on a radial pattern of 5 points or 5 parts, and their body wall contains calcium carbonate plates, often with projecting spines. They also have tube feet with suction pads for movement. So examples of these are starfish, a sand dollar, or a sea urchin. And then finally we have chordates, which is the phyla that humans belong to. So these have a notochord or rod running down the body. Most have a backbone. They have a dorsal nerve cord with the anterior or front end usually enlarged, forming the brain. They also have an internal skeleton of bones and cartilage. So here we can see a full layout of the entire animal kingdom. And let us focus a bit more on the chordates, since that is the phyla that we belong to. We're going to see that this divides into Pisces or fish, amphibians. It also includes reptiles, birds, and of course mammals. And then very briefly, let's just look at the plant kingdom for a second. So there are 4 main phyla of the plant kingdom. We have the bryophytes, or mosses and liverworts. We have ferns, conifers, which include the pine and fir tree, and then flowering plants, which are then divided into monocotyledons and dicotyledons.